Hi, my name is Rebecca Davis Gibbons. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Southern Maine. I study nuclear nonproliferation and broadly nuclear issues, issues of global order and global governance. I have a book that came out in the summer of 2022 that looks at the ways in which the US has played a leading role in orchestrating and promoting the nuclear nonproliferation regime centered on the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. So I spent a lot of time looking at the NPT and treaties, and more recently looking at what is known as the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force in 2021. I first started to pay attention to nuclear weapons and nuclear issues the year after I graduated from college. I went with several other classmates to a tiny island in the Pacific called Kili, Kili. That is an island where some former Bikini residents and their families were moved after the U.S. Moved them off the atoll of Bikini in 1946 to test nuclear weapons there. So that community was moved from Bikini. They were put in some different places, at some point facing starvation. Eventually, some of them were moved to this tiny uninhabited island at the time called Kili. It's a relatively small island. It doesn't have an atoll. It's a kind of a coral island. That makes a lot of the traditional ways of life that they had there difficult. And so I was there teaching in the elementary school with some other folks I graduated with, and I taught second graders and fourth graders social studies. And so part of teaching social studies, I had to explain why they ended up where they were. They knew they could all draw these beautiful pictures of mushroom clouds over an atoll. I have a couple in my office. So they knew something about nuclear weapons and had this imagery, but didn't necessarily know the history and the Cold War and why the U.S. felt the need to test, and what had happened subsequently. So while I was there for that year, I decided I did want to pursue international relations and become a professor. I went to Georgetown University for a master's in international security. And while I was there, I was able to work with a professor, Kai Barth, who was studying the Iranian nuclear program. And his background was in physics and history. And so we really looked at the different potential scientists and physicists who are part of that program, and almost did like open source intelligence in terms of looking at the relationships and looking at who was working on what issue areas, what journals, what had they published in journals, say, for example, about what they were working on. And I did that for 2 years and really learned a lot more about the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and international safeguards, or nuclear safeguards. And so he had me also read just a lot of books to learn background. And so I knew I wanted to get a PhD, but I went in the workforce and worked for a consulting firm for a little while, but a job came up to work as a contractor for the Air Force in their arms control shop about a year after I graduated with my master's. And this wasn't, I worked in the Pentagon for several years with the Air Force's group that works on arms control. So we were supporting New START negotiations. I worked on the implementation of the additional protocol and just generally followed issues related to nuclear weapons. While I was there, I applied for a PhD and was able to do that while still working part-time for the Air Force. And so what's interesting about that, I think, is just it's given me a lot of different perspectives from the people who are, physically affected and culturally affected by nuclear weapons and testing, to looking at sort of a military perspective and looking at arms control. And so I finished my PhD and I became a professor, and since then have taught international relations. Yeah, so I love teaching about nuclear topics. I teach a class about every other year that's specifically on nuclear issues, but I am able to kind of sprinkle it into other, like an introduction to international relations class on the UN. And so my approach when I teach the nuclear class is we do look at the history of the nuclear age. We look a little bit at the science and the physics of nuclear weapons and how that's developed from fission to fusion and to different delivery vehicles. We look at why states, or why theoretically why we think states develop nuclear weapons, why so many states have not developed nuclear weapons. I do really try to spend a good amount of time. This goes back to my experience on Kiwi and visiting Hiroshima and really paying attention to how these weapons, both in testing, but even in their development in terms of uranium mining, have affected communities. So we do talk a lot about different affected communities, what their governments do or do not do in terms of aiding those communities. And then we spend a lot of time on policies for addressing nuclear weapons. So we look at counterproliferation, non-proliferation, we look at the various treaties, we look at disarmament. In my class, we have, I like to have debates. So we have a debate first over the ethics of nuclear deterrence, looking at different ethical perspectives. And that really helps students, I think, really dig into the issue of what deterrence means and what are the implications. And then at the end of the semester, we always have a debate over whether the US should be actively pursuing a policy of global nuclear disarmament and how that might work. And so it's a lot of hands-on research, digging into different case studies and trying to challenge them to think about nuclear weapons and the role of nuclear weapons in the world today. Everyone does an original research project, and I've had some great examples of projects. Students have surveyed their classmates about what they think about nuclear weapons. They've done research into like the generation, the young people today. How did they learn about nuclear weapons? When were they first exposed? It's video games is what it seems to be the biggest thing. Besides learning about the end of World War II and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a lot of them, their exposure to the existence of nuclear weapons did come through video games. And honestly, sometimes very callous portrayals of what that means. And we have people who look at different groups that are affected or look at new technologies and how that will affect nuclear weapons. So runs the gamut. But I do like to have students engage in original research and look at primary source documents when they can. I think a lot about the general public and lack of awareness about nuclear issues. I think it's really unfortunate. Of course, we know with the end of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear weapons didn't go away. I don't think that most people necessarily know that most of the weapons today are much more powerful than the weapons that were detonated on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I always think that our lives are just very complicated right now, and people only have so much bandwidth to focus on certain issues. And, whether it's issues of thinking about their own personal economies and inflation, or climate change is, of course, an important issue, or local politics, we all are tied in or pulled in so many different directions in our lives. And so it is in a way a lot to ask the public to like spend some real time in thinking about nuclear weapons and being educated, but I think it's very important, and I take that as a charge as part of my mission in life, or professional mission, is to help educate the public where I can. I like to do talks in the community about nuclear issues. I think it's important both because it's an existential threat, right? Along with potential pandemics and climate change. I mean, it is one of the threats to civilization. And so I think people should know about it for that reason, but also as taxpayers and voters, the public needs to know. I mean, in the US, right, we're spending, well over $1 trillion to recapitalize the triad, all three legs, plus specific bombs. And so there's really no public debate about that. And that's a huge expenditure. And so I wish there was more public debate, both about the money that we're spending, the policies we have, the policy of maintaining a nuclear deterrent, what that means long term. Also, I wish more people just knew about the treaties to manage proliferation. But again, it's an existential threat, and I understand why the public's not aware, but I think it's really important to have things like Enriched and other kind of people who are trying to be creative in thinking about how the public can engage more with this issue, a very busy and overtapped, overextended public. Given that the Russian Federation's war on Ukraine continues to be ongoing, and that Putin has issued nuclear threats, that is obviously a big concern, that there's some sort of lowering the bar about discussing nuclear weapons, and that that threatening their use might seem okay. So that really concerns me, just the norms about how we talk about nuclear weapons. We do see nuclear weapon states putting greater emphasis on their nuclear arsenals. This includes Russia creating new types of delivery vehicles, China increasing its arsenal. So there's a lot of kind of unfortunate trends when it comes to the nuclear weapon states and what they're doing. And that includes the lack of progress on arms control, right? As the US and Russia become increasingly adversarial, we're seeing that there's not necessarily ongoing discussions for a follow-on for the New START agreement, the agreement that puts a limit on strategic nuclear weapons and allows both sides to have more insight into the other's arsenal. So the exchanging of information, the on-site inspections, like I think it'd be really problematic if we lose those. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of nuclear trends that are unfortunate, and that we have this big divide in the international community where some states really feel strongly about holding on to their nuclear arsenals because they think they're necessary for their security, and then a whole other group of states say, no, these weapons aren't a source of security, they're a source of insecurity. And I think bridging that gap is really important, and it's going to be difficult.